Another common question that I receive is people ask, is there anything that they can do to improve upon the regulator that we've sold, or the regulator that they've purchased from another manufacturer, because they're all, as we've already discussed, very similar to each other. You know, is there anything that can do to make it any better? You know, a bit like you buy a Volkswagen Golf GTI and then you put a different chip in it to get a bit more power out of it. Is there anything you can do to your regulator to make it much better? I think the simple answer is no. There might be a couple of little things which we'll discuss in a minute, but before we do that, I want to talk about things that you mustn't do, because this is a common mistake. I've spoke to a number of people about it, and I've made this mistake myself in the past, well, when I first started with air guns many years ago. So we'll just cover that now. So you've received your regulator, and lots of people are always very keen to take things to bits to see how they work, aren't we, boys and girls? The amount of things we've had to bits over the years and can't get them back together again. Now, the thing that you'd probably notice if you take any regulator to pieces is the fit of the piston into the bore. So you'd take your regulator to bits and you'd think, oh blimey, that's a bit of a loose fit, or as we say in England, it's as loose as a prick up a shirt sleeve. And you'd think to yourself, oh, that's not much good. Oh, I could make another one better myself. I know what, I've got my lathe, I'll make myself a new piston. This is where you're liable to find yourself having a bit of a disaster. And I say this because going back all those years, I looked at a couple of regulators when I was around at a gentleman called Mick Dawes's house, and we were playing around and we'd got somebody else's regulator, and the piston seemed to be quite a loose fit. And so when I came home and thought I'd make my own, I thought, I know what we'll do, we'll make it really, really good, polished and honed so it fits perfectly. And by this I mean, at the time I was heavily into little model diesel engines, and if any of you have had any of these, you'll know that they've not got piston rings on, and if you listen, that pop is the compression, and you can see the propeller twanging round. And the piston is an exceptionally good fit in the bore. If you take one of these to bits, it can be quite fiddly getting them back together because the fit is so good. So at the time, because I made a couple of little model engine parts, I thought I'd do the same with the regulator. And I made a piston that fitted in absolutely perfectly. It was virtually an airtight fit. You could put your finger over the end and push it up and down like this, cover the holes, and it would bounce back and forth. And I thought, how clever. It lasted about 200 shots and then it seized up. Now, most of the regulators that have looked at, or that you go on the internet and search the pictures of, all the cases are made out of aluminium, and there's a reason for that. It's light, it's cheap, it's easy to work, and it's perfect for the job. There's never really any problems with it whatsoever, so that's very good. Now the problem comes if you think that you're going to improve on the piston fit, and I shall just talk about why. When the O-rings around your piston and it goes up and down, obviously once it's under pressure it stops being round and it ends up being fairly square, and the force upon the O-ring isn't just pressing the piston backwards, it is also pressing the piston out into the bore as well. You know, it's quite a large sideways force. Well, I don't know how much it'd be, but it is a lot. If you get something where you've got two pistons and an air pocket in the middle, trying to push the unit back and forth can be quite difficult. So you've got a backwards force and a sideways force. Now the problem with this is, if the case is made out of aluminium, which they predominantly are, so it's a bought regulator, or it could be one you've made yourself with an aluminium case, you make this piston a perfect fit, virtually an airtight fit. The problem is this force pressing outwards means that, where's my grey marker pen? Oh, I've not got one. I'll continue to use this green one. As the piston moves back and forward a bit, it actually rubs the aluminium into a bit of a wave like that. Now this movement of metal, it isn't a great deal. You'd have a hell of a job to measure it unless you've got some very good equipment, but that is what it does. You know, the thousands of cycles this piston does, moving a teeny bit back and forth with the O-ring pressing outwards, it can move the metal very slightly. So if you've made a piston which is an absolutely perfect fit into the bore, you could soon find, or over a length of time, that with this very slight movement of the aluminium, your piston will seize absolutely solid. And if it doesn't affect it at that particular moment in time, you could find that when you actually come to take the regulator to bits to service it, that your piston gets to about here and then it's jammed solid. Getting it out after that can just about be an impossibility. If you've done this already and had this problem, you won't be the first. I did it. I spoke to Mick Dawes at the time about it, and he said, oh, I've done that as well. And some years later, I spoke to a gentleman, Nick Murphy, who you might know off the FT circuit, and I think he'd also had a similar occurrence when he had started building regulators. So there does need to be a tolerance between your piston and your aluminium body case. If you're making the body case in steel or bronze, you know, it isn't going to be so much of the case, and you can make a slightly better fitting piston if you wish. But with the aluminium ones, please be careful. To the other extreme, some people might tell you that, oh, you need to have the piston very loose. There has been a problem in the past with a certain manufacturer's regulators in the fact that they were failing on a fairly regular basis. This was not someone such as ourselves, but an actual big named brand of airgun manufacturer, and the piston was quite small, and over a length of time the rubber O-ring extruded under the force down between the piston and the bore aluminium case wall, and that also caused serious mechanical failure of the regulator. Sticking on about the regulators and the pistons, if we move this down here, to do with the knife edge in many of the regulators, I think the tendency would be, one, if you're making your own, don't make it too blunt, because it'll need more force to seal it against the seat. The ones on most of the regulators, I think this angle on either side is going to be, I'm going to write this upside down. No, that's back to front, isn't it? It's going to be about 60. It's going to be about 60 degrees, and on the end of that, you're going to need to make sure that you maintain a very small flat. I think looking at this picture, that flat's about 0.15 millimeters. I say that because the temptation again is for you to think, oh, I'll make the knife edge as sharp as you possibly can, and that'll cut off quicker. The problem with that is, if you ever had a go at making your own knives or sharpening them, if you make the edge too thin, you're going to end up with a very brittle edge which will break quite easily, and then you're going to end up with bits of brass buried into your valve seat. The regulator won't work properly, and then trying to clean the brass fragments out of the valve seat could be quite difficult. So please avoid the temptation to make yourself a new piston that's a very good fit, and also don't go over sharpening your knife edge face on the piston either, otherwise both could lead to disaster. When you say what could you do to it, there isn't a very great deal. On the back here, if you've got the regulator installed and you've set it at the working pressure that you're happy with, and you're quite content that you're not going to alter it, so say this one's set at about 80 bar, as you can see there is some surplus metal around the back here. So if you've got a regulator where you're not going to need to put a tool in for a forward extraction out of the reservoir, then you could always put it in your lathe and just skim that bit of metal off just to give you a teeny bit more reservoir space. And the same with this outer diameter. You could remove about probably 1.5 millimeters off the OD just to give you a little bit more airspace. For Christ's sake, don't go cutting into here, because that contains the spring, and the wall is quite thick, but it's not, you know, endlessly thick. And as you know, these springs are as hard as hell, so there's a lot of force going on in here. So don't go thinking to yourself, oh, I'll skim 2 mil off this bit for a bit of extra airspace, because you could find yourself leading to disaster. The only other thing that a couple of people have done, and I've done myself in the past, is move that O-ring up here so as they're close together. Obviously you've got to have your breathe hole and standoff accurately fitted, and then make a standoff here so that you've got a little bit of extra airspace, and you can make this closer to the outlet valve, and your other chamber will be slightly bigger. But in general, it doesn't matter whose regulator you've got. I greatly avoid the temptation to go drilling, screwing, lathing and doing anything else to it if it's working okay. You know, there's that many other things that you could do, like weigh your pellets out, make sure you've not put too much grease on, put your scope mounts at exactly the right height, which I doubt many of you sadly have, and things like that. So I hope that's been of some help. Avoid the temptation to play with the piston.